history remembers the Battle of Shiloh as one of the bloodiest 2 days in American history. Historians remember something else entirely. They remember what happened after the guns stopped, and for over a century, what happened in that dark, freezing Tennessee field has been argued over, dismissed, and quietly debated in corners of medical history that most people never hear about. Because the accepted story, the one you will find in most textbooks, leaves out the part that actually defies explanation. The question is not whether Shiloh was catastrophic. It was. The question is what exactly happened to the men who survived it, and why the answer still makes serious researchers uncomfortable. Let's start with what everyone agrees on. April 6th and 7th, 1862. 2 days. 23,000 casualties, Union and Confederate combined. More American deaths in 48 hours than in the entire Revolutionary War. The military medical system did not collapse under that weight. It was obliterated. Not slowly, not gradually. It was gone within hours of the first day's fighting. And what replaced it was improvisation, desperation, and the kind of decisions that haunt men for the rest of their lives. There were not enough surgeons. There were not enough stretchers. There was not enough chloroform, not enough thread, not enough hands. Men lay in open fields on bare mud with bullets still inside them, waiting for help that the mathematics of the situation simply would not allow to arrive in time. The surgeons who were there, and accounts from multiple field journals confirm this independently, worked for 48 hours without stopping until some of them lost consciousness at their own operating tables. Not stepped away, not rested, lost consciousness mid-procedure, and were pulled off their patient eyes by assistants who were barely standing themselves. Outside the tents, the amputated limbs piled higher than a man's waist. One chaplain described them as pyramids. Several surgeons' diaries use the same word without any apparent coordination. That specific detail matters, because when multiple sources who had no contact with each other reach for identical language, historians take notice. It suggests they were describing the same reality, not echoing each other's accounts. The bone saws dulled. There were not enough replacements. Surgeons were operating with instruments that dragged through tissue rather than cut it, on men who were fully conscious because the anesthesia was gone, held down by leather straps and the weight of another man's body. The screaming from those tents was documented by witnesses positioned half a mile away. This is the baseline. This is before the night came. And the night is where the historical record begins to fracture. Because what the surgeons described seeing in the hours after darkness fell on April 7th has been treated very differently depending on which historian is reading it, which decade they were writing in, and, if we are being honest, how comfortable they were with evidence that does not resolve cleanly. The dominant interpretation, the one Civil War historians repeated for generations without serious challenge, is simple. After the battle, in the chaos and near-total darkness, some soldiers and surgeons reported seeing a faint luminescence coming from open wounds. This was noted in several field journals, mentioned in a handful of pension record testimonies, and then largely set aside. The explanation offered by the medical establishment of the era was straightforward. Phosphorescent marsh gas rising from the saturated ground, or the natural bioluminescence of decomposing organic matter, a strange optical effect produced by an extreme environment. Unsettling, perhaps. Medically irrelevant. That interpretation held, largely unchallenged, for nearly 140 years. And it has a serious weakness, because the men whose wounds glowed, and this is where the surviving documentation becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss, did not die at the expected rate. They survived at a measurably higher rate than the men whose wounds showed no luminescence. This is not a single surgeon's note. It appears across multiple post-battle medical assessments, in pension claim records that have no reason to embellish survival outcomes, and in the recollections of soldiers who had no knowledge of each other's accounts when they gave testimony years later. The surgeons who observed this noted it with what you can only describe as reluctant bewilderment. They had expected the glowing wounds to be the worst cases. In 1862, any wound that looked unusual, any wound that behaved in a way outside the known progression of injury, was assumed to be moving toward infection, amputation, or death. These men expected to find the glowing soldiers among the dead by morning. Instead, those men were recovering faster. The wound tissue was cleaner. The signs of gangrene, the blackening at the edges, the unmistakable foul smell that every Civil War surgeon knew meant the end was coming, the spreading necrosis that moved through a limb like fire through dry wood, were absent. Not reduced, absent. Now, there are historians who look at this evidence and argue the correlation proves nothing, that the survival data from Shiloh is too incomplete, too inconsistently recorded, too contaminated by the chaos of an institution that was simultaneously trying not to collapse while attempting to document what was happening around it. That the surgeons who noted the glow were men working in near-total darkness after 2 days without sleep, and that perception under those conditions cannot be trusted as scientific observation. That what they saw was marsh gas, decomposition, exhausted eyes finding patterns in a dark field full of the worst things they had ever witnessed. That argument is not unreasonable, and it held serious weight for a long time. But it has a problem that grows harder to ignore the more carefully you read the primary sources. Marsh gas does not concentrate on open wounds. Phosphorescent organic decay does not pulse from living tissue in a cold blue-white light, while leaving the surrounding ground dark. And the surgeons who documented this phenomenon were not describing a general atmospheric glow across the field. They were describing light emerging specifically, consistently, and repeatedly from the wounds themselves. Not from the ground beside them, not from the bodies of the dead, from open wounds on living men. Multiple accounts, multiple positions across the same battlefield, written independently, in some cases days apart, by men who were not in communication with each other, all describing the same cold color, all noting the same localization to wound tissue, all expressing the same confusion, and in several cases, the same fear about what they were seeing. So the first fault line in this historical debate is clear. Was the glow a real, localized biological phenomenon, or was it an environmental effect misread by traumatized, exhausted men operating at the outer edge of human endurance? The evidence, read without the comfort of a predetermined answer, favors the first interpretation. But accepting that the glow was real only opens the door to the deeper argument, because if something bioluminescent was genuinely present in those wounds, the question becomes what it was doing, and whether the survival correlation was caused by it or simply coincided with it. That is where the debate becomes genuinely difficult and genuinely important. The competing explanations within the FEAT historical and medical research community divide roughly into 2 positions. The first position holds that the bioluminescence was incidental, that whatever organism entered those wounds from the soil produced light as a biological byproduct without meaningfully affecting the patient's condition. Under this reading, the higher survival rates are explained by other variables: wound depth, wound location, the random distribution of surgical attention across a field too large and too chaotic for any systematic treatment. Maybe the men who glowed happened to have less catastrophically damaged tissue to begin with. Maybe they were lying on marginally higher ground and stayed slightly drier through the night. The data cannot prove causation, this position argues, and we should not pretend otherwise. The second position argues that the organism was not passive, that it was not simply present in those wounds. It was working actively, chemically, with a ruthlessness that no surgeon in 1862 had any concept of, because the germ theory of disease was not yet widely accepted and the idea that invisible organisms could fight each other inside human tissue for dominance was not part of any medical framework available to anyone on that battlefield. This is where the science becomes either a miracle or a perfectly logical piece of microbiology that history was simply not equipped to recognize when it happened. The soil of the Shiloh region, dark, waterlogged, rich Tennessee River Valley woodland soil, is home to a specific genus of microscopic parasitic worms called nematodes. These organisms live in the earth, travel through moisture, and enter open tissue. They are, on their own, unremarkable. What makes them relevant is what they carry inside them. A bacterium called Photohabdus luminescens. Break that name apart. Photo light, rhabdus, rod-shaped, luminescens glowing. It is a glowing rod bacterium, and it is one of the only naturally bioluminescent organisms ever confirmed to colonize living human tissue. It produces a cold blue-white light, continuous, steady, visible in darkness, and it is extraordinarily hostile to other bacteria. Photohabdus luminescens does not simply coexist with the microbial environment it enters. It destroys it. It secretes a broad-spectrum array of antibiotic compounds, not one mechanism, but several, operating simultaneously, because the nematodes that carry it require a sterile environment inside a host in order to reproduce. So the bacterium does what 4 billion years of evolution designed it to do. It kills everything else in the wound, including Clostridium perfringens, the pathogen responsible for gas gangrene, the infection that was moving through Civil War field hospitals like a second army, killing men who had survived surgery, survived the battle, survived everything the enemy had thrown at them, including the bacteria responsible for wound sepsis. The systemic infection that accounted for a devastating proportion of non-combat Civil War deaths. At Shiloh on that specific night, the conditions were, by a convergence of circumstance so precise it strains the vocabulary of coincidence, almost perfectly calibrated for Photohabdus luminescens to survive and operate inside human tissue. The soldiers had been lying in cold rain and mud for hours. Their core body temperatures had dropped significantly, and this is the detail that sits at the absolute center of the debate. The detail that the dismissive interpretation cannot easily account for. Photohabdus luminescens operates most effectively at temperatures below normal human body heat. At normal body temperature, the human immune system suppresses and eliminates it before it can establish. But in a hypothermic patient, in a man whose temperature has been driven down by cold mud and freezing rain and blood loss, the bacteria finds a window. The cold that was killing them was simultaneously creating the conditions under which something was fighting to save them. That is the paradox. That is the piece of this story that has kept it alive in medical history discussions for decades, despite the incompleteness of the documentary record, because it is not simply a strange observation from an unreliable source. It is a biologically coherent mechanism, confirmed in modern laboratory conditions, mapped onto a specific set of environmental circumstances that are themselves historically documented. The historians who resist this explanation are not being irrational. The Civil War medical record is genuinely inconsistent. The chaos of Shiloh's aftermath was real, and it contaminated the documentation in ways that cannot be fully corrected. The surgeons who observed the glow were not trained scientists. They had no microscopes, no controlled conditions, no comparison groups. Their observations, however consistent, do not constitute clinical evidence by any modern standard. And yet the mechanism is not speculation. The bacteria is not hypothetical. The antibiotic compounds are not theoretical. They have been isolated, characterized, and confirmed. The nematodes are native to that soil. The temperature dependency is documented biology. So the debate is not about whether Photohabdus luminescens can do what the second camp claims it did at Shiloh. The science says it can. The debate is about whether it actually did. Whether the chain we are assembling from broken records and exhausted men's journals is the real chain, or whether we are connecting points that were never actually connected, because the story they form is too extraordinary to leave alone. History loves a miracle. That love is a bias, and good historical thinking requires treating it as one, the most defensible position, the one that accounts for both the strength of the biological mechanism and the weakness of the evidentiary record, is this. The evidence is strongly suggestive, but not conclusive. The glow was almost certainly real. The bacteria is the plausible explanation for it by a significant margin. The survival correlation is consistent with the proposed mechanism, but the record is too incomplete to close the case. What we can say without serious qualification is this. On the night of April 7th, 1862, at Shiloh, in freezing mud in total darkness, surrounded by feral animals, drawn from the forest by the smell of blood, with no medicine left and no surgeon able to reach them, some of those men were being kept alive by something no one had ordered, no one had planned, and no one could explain. An organism that had lived in that soil for millions of years before the first human being set foot on it, before the first shot was fired, before the first uniform was designed or the first cannon was cast. It was there long before the war, doing what it had always done, indifferent to the suffering around it, following nothing but the logic of its own survival. And in following that logic, it saved them. The soldiers called it Angel's Glow. The name is not scientific, but it is not wrong either. In the middle of the worst failure of human organization and human mercy that the American continent had yet produced, something intervened. Not with intention, not with compassion, with chemistry and cold and the blind, ruthless efficiency of a microscopic organism that had been perfecting its methods for longer than our species has existed. A living antibiotic, operating in the mud, 80 years before Alexander Fleming would deliberately search for one. The dominant history of Shiloh is a story of catastrophe and survival. The deeper history is a story about what we do not see, what we cannot explain, and what was working on our behalf in the dark before we had the language to describe it. History remembers Shiloh one way. The evidence suggests the story is not finished. Which interpretation do you find most convincing? The bacteria that accidentally saved them through blind biological logic, or the argument that exhausted surgeons in a dark field built a story we have been completing ever since? Leave it in the comments, because historians are still arguing about it, and they should be. The questions that stay open are the ones worth keeping. If that is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. The best stories are always the ones without clean endings.